Hey guys, before the video gets started, I want to apologize for my sick sounding voice. Got a bit of a sinus infection, but really who gives a shit. So this video is going to be about the clown scare that's going on around the country right now. It's pretty creepy. I live in Vancouver, Washington area, and Portland, Oregon was hit recently with some sick fuck who was dressed in like an all black suit with his little white and black clown mask. And he apparently snuck up on some lady in the middle of the night. She was sitting in her car on her cell phone, and this prick just decides to slam on her window, scaring the shit out of her. And then the cops arrested him, so I saw this whole thing go down on the news, so kind of inspired me to get after this clown business. So without any further BS, let's do it. In 1981, the United States experienced the Phantom Clown Scare. You won't find many details about the Phantom Clown Scare on Wikipedia or in textbooks. You're lucky if you can still find articles about it in your local library. The people who remember it whisper of the weird, terrible, and strange stories. They could still feel the repercussions throughout the next 20 years. My dad was 6 when the Phantom Clown Scare happened. He had been playing outside during recess at school when the first clown appeared. Dressed in a traditional white and red clown suit with matching red nose, the clown did not pose as a threat. In fact, he would make balloon animals for the children, tossing them over the fence, and he watched as they played with them. Eventually, animal balloons turned into talking to some of the kids, oftentimes doing impressions of popular cartoon characters, Scooby-Doo and the Roadrunner. Laughter filled the playground when the clown was there. Joy was in the air. Kids looked forward to recess solely to see the clown and the tricks he had up his sleeve for that day. Eventually, the laughter came to an abrupt end when the clown began to lure kids into the forest adjacent to the school. Now it's all happening again in my town of Greenville, South Carolina. We lived a decent lifestyle. We were not poor, nor were we rich. We were somewhere in between. My parents were high school sweethearts who wanted to get out of their own crummy little town in Massachusetts and start their lives over in South Carolina. It was my dad's idea, and my mom followed along. Greenville wasn't all that bad. We had a small downtown area where stores ranged from boutiques to coffee shops, and one big franchise grocery store. When my parents had first moved here, it wasn't as booming with civilians as it is now. My dad opened up his own mechanic shop, which struggled for a few years, but according to our statements, it seems to be doing much better now. And my mom picked up a part-time librarian job. 16 years later, I was born. My name is Jake, by the way. Maybe I should have told you that earlier on. Anyways, after I was born, they waited to have my younger brother, who is now 6 years old, and his name is Daniel. Doesn't matter if you live under a rock or don't listen to the news. You've heard what's been happening lately in Greenville County. This week in an apartment complex called the Fleetwood Manor, children began to complain about clowns standing near a forest, trying to lure them in with toys, candy, and even money. An official letter went out to the residents of Fleetwood Manor and those living nearby a 10-mile radius. Fear spiked the town. Children were no longer allowed to go out without supervision, and curfew was effective immediately. My mother was hysterical when she found out about it on the news. Fortunately, we didn't live in Fleetwood Manor. We lived a couple streets down in the newer subdivisions that face the middle of the forest. 3 days ago, Daniel turned 6. All he wanted for his birthday was a clown who could make balloon animals like the clown at Terry Dowell's birthday did. My parents immediately objected to the idea, making a whole ordeal out of it. My mom had walked into the den, immediately occupying herself with a book. I know she'd read this book cover to cover 4 times. My dad kept his head down as he scrubbed the dishes, claiming he would hear no more of this nonsense. It was one thing to not like clowns. It was a common thing, but the distaste my parents exhibited was on a whole new level. When my dad came into the room later that night to check up on me, I asked him about what happened earlier that day. I told him it was probably some college kids pulling a prank before going back to school, or even a promotional stunt for Stephen King's remake of the movie It. I remember my dad looked at me like I was completely out of line. At first, he didn't want to talk about it, but with lots of convincing and me promising not to repeat this story to Daniel, he reluctantly told me the story. So, here it is in his words. When I was around Daniel's age, life was very different in the 80s. Your grandparents raised me in Brookline, Massachusetts, in a similar subdivision like the one you live in now. We would ride our bikes from dusk till dawn. We'd stay out late playing in the playground, and we would ride around all over town, fearlessly. Kids didn't go missing back then. Kids were not targets for pedophiles and killers. Do you follow me? Okay, good. In May, things changed. Our innocence was ripped from our hands because of these damned clowns. There was this one clown that would stand outside my school, befriending us kids. At first, we thought he was harmless. He would bring us treats and make animal balloons. Then, once he gained our trust, he would show us things that no child should see. He would threaten to do things to us if we'd told an adult. Then, Tommy O'Donnell went missing. Us kids knew what happened. The clown had taken him. The whole town was put under curfew, and there were police all over the streets, just like now. Eventually, kids started to speak up about the clown. What my friends and I did the next night after Tommy was reported missing haunts me to this day. We biked near the school where there was a connecting forest. We went into the forest to search for Tommy. What we found instead? Jake, I don't want to scare you. There was the clown. His red lipstick was smeared across his face in a sinister grin. We could see his real teeth. They were sharp and yellow. His eyes were such a light hazel, they almost gleamed yellow in the moonlight. He was standing near a small fire, and around him, more clowns like the one near our school. Their clothes were tattered and dirty, their makeup smeared and melted through their masks. Their red noses were thrown into the fire along with their white gloves. Their fingernails were coated in dirt, chewed to skin, the cuticles bloody. These clowns were no longer welcoming. They were terrifying. We spotted Tommy, who was drugged and barely moving. My friend Quan grew up in a family of martial arts fighters, and he ran towards one of the clowns while I hid in the bushes. He went straight for one of the clowns who had his back turned, and he jumped on their back. He wanted to rip off the mask the clown was wearing, but the clown kept screaming. The other clowns were pulling Quan off the clown's back, but that little bugger would not let go. He had the grip of a snake. I watched as he tried to rip off the mask, but he couldn't. It was sewn to his face. Every pull Quan did at the strings of the mask, which was a clown's own skin. Have you ever seen muscles under skin, son? The pink and red muscles had an elasticity, which made it convenient to use as a string. And the screams, oh God, screams were deafening. I thought it would never end. I watched as they finally got Quan to the ground, drugging him too. I couldn't run or move. They would catch me. So I stayed crouched and hidden behind the bushes and watched what they did to Quan. Slowly they began to cut the skin of his bones, first starting with his arms, legs, and finally moving towards his face. The worst part was that Quan was beginning to come to, and he could feel everything. They began to sew pieces together, making another mask, and sewed it onto Tommy's face, making him unrecognizable. After that, they began to pick at what was left of his body, roasting the skin over fire like marshmallows, popping parts of skin into their mouth, chewing the bones, eating Quan until there was nothing left. This is what they did. They were building a clown cult or something, calling themselves the Phantom Clowns. I waited behind the bush for hours on end before they finally left. I can't remember how or when they left. It was as if they disappeared into thin air. Finally, when morning came, I ran to the police. They went back to the place in the forest, but there was nothing. No body, no skin pieces, no bones. It was as if the clowns were not even there. There was no more missing kids after that night. Curfew was lifted, and Brookline went back to how it was before. A couple months later in Kansas, there was news about a group of clowns luring in through the use of treats and candies. Children went missing. The police could not find a trace. For years, there was nothing. It's as if the clowns had stopped hunting children. Rumor has it, if there is a news break of clowns luring children in, the only way to get rid of them is for them to move to the next town, is to sacrifice one of your children of the town. I watched as my dad wiped a tear from his eye. I had only seen him cry once before, and that was at Grandma's funeral. He let out a deep sigh. Then he closed his eyes. "Do you think it's happening again?" I asked him. My father looked at me, the emotion drained from his face. "Pray tonight, my son." He got up and walked towards my bedroom, his finger hovering over the light switch. I'll never know what was going through my dad's mind that night. The way he looked at me was like I was a stranger in my own body. When I had finally fallen asleep, I dreamt of cannibalistic clowns. Go figure. Thanks, Dad. I had jolted awake, sweat was pooling down my back, and my hair was soaking wet. I slowed down my breathing, and that's when I heard it. Whispering. It was whispers between my dad and my younger brother, Daniel. Sounded like my dad was trying to calm him down. Daniel was known to have night terrors. I had cursed Dad for telling him such a scary story while Daniel was up. I was sure he must have crept to my room and listened, thus having the same nightmares as myself, and triggering his night terrors. After a couple of minutes of silence filled the house once more, I was finally drifting back off into sleep when I heard the front door close. I opened my eyes and sat up, listening for any footsteps. There was none. Nobody was breaking into our house. I slipped out from under my covers, my feet touching the cold hardwood floor. I walked towards the window and peered out into the darkness that cloaked the town. The small street light was flickering on and off, ready to give out. Under the street light, I could make out two figures, one taller man and one small child. It took me a minute to realize that the tall man and the small child were my dad and Daniel. I watched as they held hands and walked towards the edge of the forest. I pounded on the window shouting, "No! No! What are you doing? Come back, Dad! Daniel!" I watched in horror as my dad stopped at the edge of the forest, pausing before looking down at Daniel. Daniel looked up at him. I can imagine the confusion in his eyes as he obeyed my father's wishes. My dad knelt down to kiss Daniel on the forehead before giving him a gentle nudge to walk forward towards the forest. That was the night I lost my brother. He was officially reported missing after 48 hours. When the police questioned my parents, Dad claimed to have no recollection of that night. But I knew better. I had watched as my dad sacrificed his own son to the clowns to rid them from his town.